In this video, I show you how to light, texture, and render a nice cozy interior scene in V-Ray 5, and this will be our final render after we are done. To be able to follow along properly, you need to know the basics of working with V-Ray, as I'll be very fast and won't explain the basics here. You might find this video a bit hard to follow. The best place to learn V-Ray for 3ds Max from the ground up is our V-Ray 5 Masterclass. It's an amazing course that covers V-Ray through and through, more than 15 hours of high quality, scripted, academically approached content. The link is in the description. Go check it out as soon as you can. Now let's get back to the lesson itself. First, we need to work on the lighting. It's fairly simple. I want my key light to come from the left side, then I'll have two fill lights from above and the right side. And we also need a light for our floor lamp. I already have a V-Ray physical camera in the scene with its exposure value set to around 10, which is a good starting point for interior shots. Let's start IPR and enable lighting mode. For our key light, add a plain light to the scene. Align it with the dummy helper on the left side of the camera so we can save some time. Make it a 100 cm by 100 cm light. Change the unit to radiance power and multiplier to 70 watts. And finally increase the direction 2.6 so we can have a bit more focused light on our subjects. Now let's add our first fill light from the right side. I'm just going to copy my key light and align it with the dummy helper that I have on the right side. As it's a fill light, it should be less bright compared to the key light, so let's use something like 15 watts. We can also make the light more spread by reducing directionality to 0.3. We need one last fill light from above, so just copy the right fill light and align it with the helper dummy that I have placed it right above the couch. If I turn off my key light and my other fill light, I can see how the second fill light contributes to the lighting. Cool. Let's turn them back on. And finally, we need a light for our floor lamp. So let's add a sphere light. Align it with this helper dummy that is right inside the shade. Select the light and change its radius to 3 centimeters. Unit to radiance power and multiplier to 4. Change the color mode to temperature and use a low Kelvin temperature like 1700 so we get a warm orangish tone. And that is our final lighting. Now let's take care of our materials. I'll start with the wall, which is the biggest element in the scene, and it will have a bold teal color. In the material editor, create a new V-Ray material and assign it to the wall geometry. Add a V-Ray color node. As we are in ACES, change the RGB primaries to sRGB and change the color to this teal color with the RGB values of 22, 85, and 77. I want to mix this color with a slightly darker teal, so copy the color node and change the color to this darker teal with the RGB values of 18, 55, and 53. To mix the two nodes, add a mix node or mix map and use those two color nodes as color 1 and color 2 and use the mix map itself as the diffuse map for the material. Now we need to create a black and white map to mix between these two colors and to be used as the mix amount. So add a V-Ray bitmap node and load this BW38 underscore blurred map. change its RGB primaries to raw as it's a data input, and change its tiling to 3.25 and 2 so it sits better on the wall. Now add a noise map as well. Set its size to 50. Change its black color to a light gray with the RGB values of around 170. First, we need to combine these two maps before using them as a mix amount for our wall colors. So add a composite node. Use the BW38 blurred map as the first input and the noise map as the second input or second layer. And just set the opacity of the second layer to 85 so we can see a bit of our first layer as well. Now we can connect the composite map to the mix amount input of our mix map, and that will be our diffuse map. Now let's change our reflection color to white. Change the reflection mode to roughness under the BRDF settings. I'm going to shift drag the composite node to use it as the reflection roughness map. To make the roughness map a bit more interesting, I can decrease the opacity of the second layer so we can see our BW38 map a bit more. So I'm going to connect the composite map to an output node and connect the output node to the reflection roughness input. In the output node, grab the first point and set its value to 0.6, and grab the second point and change its value to 0.33. So we have basically inverted our composite map and made the values closer, and that is our wall material. Now let's go for the parquet material. I'm going to create a new Vase material and assign it to the floor. And change its reflection mode to roughness. Load this wood parquet diffuse map. And connect it to the diffuse map input of the shader. Change its RGB primaries to sRGB as we are in ACES, and this is a color input. Now duplicate the map and load the reflection roughness texture. As we are in ACES and this is a data input, change its RGB primaries to raw and connect it to the reflection roughness input. I'm going to select the material itself and change the reflection color from black to white so we can see our reflections. Add a V-Ray normal map and connect it to the bump input. Now duplicate the roughness map again and load this normal map texture. As we are in ACES and this is a normal map, change its color space to none and RGB primaries to raw and connect it to the normal map input of the Vase normal map. For the bump map, again, shift drag the roughness texture and load the bump map texture and simply connect it to the bump map input of the Vase normal map. Now select the material itself and decrease the bump amount to 10. And finally, the displacement texture, simply shift drag the bump map and load the displacement texture. And now connect it to the displacement input and lower the displacement amount to 0.5. Just a slight amount would be enough as we already have our bump and normal maps taking care of the high frequency details. Now we need to control the overall mapping of our textures for this material. I'm going to add a V-Ray triplanar and use it as the mapping source for all the textures. So let's just add a V-Ray triplanar and connect it to the mapping source input of all the textures. Change the size of the triplanar to 200 centimeter and rotation Y to 90 degrees. Cool, so that is our Parquet shader. Let's quickly create a material for this molding. I like this shader to have some subsurface scattering qualities. We can use V-Ray Material as from V-Ray 5.1, V-Ray Material comes with an amazing SSS layer, but in this case, let's use a simple fast SSS2 material. So add one and assign it to the molding. Add a V-Ray color node. Change the color to a light gray color with the values of 194. And change the RGB primaries to sRGB for the V-Ray color node. And use it as the diffuse color, subsurface color, and scatter color. Decrease the scatter radius to 0.25. And that's it. Now let's work on the couch. So I'm going to create a new V-Ray material and assign it to the upholstery fabric part of the couch. I'm going for a simple beige color to complement our bold teal wall. So add a V-Ray color node and use this beige color with the RGB values of 217, 180, and 136. Now I want to add a bit of fabric pattern to the diffuse color too, so let's add a V-Ray bitmap. Load this fabric 01 texture. Change its RGB primaries to raw and its styling to 12 and 12, as this is a data input, that's why we used raw. Now to mix the color and the shader, let's add a composite map. Use the fabric texture as the first layer and the beige color as the second layer. And change the blending mode for the second layer to average. Now, before connecting it to the diffuse color, let's make it go through a color correction just in case and connect the color correction map to the diffuse input of the material. In the color correction node, just change the mode to advanced and decrease RGB gain to 75 so the color is a bit more natural. Now let's add a bit of sheen to our fabric material to get a bit of fuzz. So I'm just going to connect my composite node before the color correction to the sheen color input and also increase sheen glossiness to 0.9. We do need a bump map as well, so add a V-Ray normal map and connect it to the bump input of the material. For the bump map, I want to mix between our fabric pattern and a wrinkly texture that I have just to add a bit more realism to the surface. So let's add a mix node. And connect it to the bump map input of the V-Ray normal map. Connect the fabric texture to the first layer. Copy the fabric pattern texture and load this wrinkles texture. As it's a data input, change the RGB primaries to raw and connect it to the second color of the mix map. And now increase the bump map amount in the V-Ray normal map to 2. So that is our fabric shader. Now select the sofa legs. I want to apply a shiny black material to the legs. So create a new V-Ray material and assign it. Change the reflection mode to roughness. Add a V-Ray color map. Use a dark color with the RGB values of around 21. And change the RGB primaries to sRGB. In the material itself, change the reflection color to white. For the reflection roughness map, load this BW38 blurred in a V-Ray bitmap node. Change its primaries to raw. As we don't have a proper UV mapping on the legs, we can run the texture through a triplanar. So add a triplanar node. And use the BW38 map as its texture input. Before changing anything in the triplanar, let's connect it to an output map. And connect the output map to the reflection roughness input of our material. Now select the triplanar and change its size to 50 centimeters. And in the output map, we can select the first point and increase its value to 0.33 and grab the second point and set its value to around 0.09. So we have basically inverted the incoming map and made the value range closer to get a shinier surface. Let's quickly create a material for one of these pillows. So let's add a new V-Ray material, assign it to the front pillow. Add a V-Ray bitmap and load this pillow 02 texture. Change its RGB primaries to sRGB as this is a color input. Connect the texture to a color correction input and use the color correction input as the diffuse map. We can go to the color correction node and increase its saturation maybe to about 35 so the colors stand out a bit more. For our sheen element, let's add a new correction map and connect our pillow texture to it again. In the color correction map, change the mode to advanced, increase gamma to 3, and now use the color correction map as the sheen color input. Now select the material and set the sheen glossiness to 0.6 so it feels more fuzzy. Now add a V-Ray normal map and connect it to the bump input. Add a new V-Ray bitmap node and load this pillow normal texture. Make sure its color space is set to none and its RGB primaries is set to raw. Connect it to the normal map input of the V-Ray normal map node. And that's it. For the second pillow, the same material was used, just change the color of the diffuse map a bit in Photoshop to give it another color. Now let's take a look at our floor lamp shaders, starting with the shade. For this, we need a V-Ray two-sided material, so let's add one and assign it. Add a new V-Ray material and use it as both front and back materials. Change the reflection mode to roughness. Use a white diffuse color with the RGB values of around 242. And also change the reflection color to white. Now we just need to create a quick reflection roughness map. So add a new V-Ray bitmap node and load this BW100 fingerprint texture. Connect it to a triplanar input as our shade does not have a good UV. Connect the triplanar to an output map and connect the output map to the reflection roughness of the material. Now select the triplanar, increase its size to 50 centimeters, and frame offset on X to 10 centimeters. And in the output map, just grab the first point and increase its value to 0.2 so we don't get a very shiny surface. Now change both of the point types to Bezier curve and add a bit upward curve so the mid values will be a bit brighter as well, which results in a bit rougher, less shinier overall surface. Now the stand itself will have a simple shiny metal material. So add and assign a new V-Ray material. Change its mode to roughness and increase its metalness to 1. Add a new V-Ray color node and change its RGB primaries to sRGB and use it as the diffuse map. Change its color to a slightly off-white color with a warmer tone with RGB values of 175, 160, and 137. Now we can add a slight variation to its surface using a reflection roughness map. So add a new V-Ray bitmap and load this BW38 texture. Because this texture will be used as a data input, we need to change its RGB color space to raw, then connect it to a triplanar node. Connect the triplanar to an output map, and finally connect the output map to the reflection roughness input. Change the triplanar size to 15 centimeters and its blend amount to 0.2. And in the output map, I just want to invert and darken the map a bit so the final shader will be shinier. I'm going to grab the first point and increase its value to 0.25. And grab the second point and decrease its value to 0.1. Now for the stand clamps, let's add a new fast SSS2 shader and assign it to the clamps geometry. Change the diffuse color and the subsurface color to a white color with the RGB values of around 220. Change the scatter color to a light orange color with the RGB values of 243, 196, and 158. Change the diffuse amount to 0.5 and scatter radius to 0.2 centimeter. And increase specular glossiness to 0.9 so we get a shinier surface. And that is our floor lamp. Let's take care of the plant and start with the vase material. It's gonna be a yellow ceramic with some level of SSS. So add a new fast SSS2 material and assign it to the vase. Add a V-Ray color node. Change its primaries to sRGB and change the color to a vibrant yellow with the RGB values of 197, 110, and 10. For the diffuse color, let's add a composite node. Use the yellow color as its layer 1 input. And for the second layer, add a V-Ray bitmap node and load this BW20 texture. Change its RGB color space to raw and connect it to the second layer input. Now change its blending mode to multiply and opacity to 70. Now select the material and decrease the scatter radius to 0.5 centimeter. For our glossiness texture, we can use the same BW20 map that we used for the diffuse texture. So connect that node to an output map and connect the output map to the glossiness input. As we are dealing with glossiness and not roughness, the brighter the values of the incoming texture, the shinier the surface. So let's grab the first point in the output node and set it to around 0.75. Grab the second point and slightly lower the value to 0.93, so the whitest part of the texture will become darker a bit and therefore the surface won't be very shiny at those parts of the texture. And finally, we can add a slight amount of bump. So let's connect the same BW20 texture to the bump map input of a very normal map node. And connect the normal map to the bump input of the material itself. Now, if we get back to the very normal node, we can decrease the bump amount to 0.1 to make the effect barely visible. Now, moving on to the leaf shader, I'm going to add a new V-Ray two-sided material and assign it to the geometry. Add a new V-Ray material and use it as the front material. Add a new V-Ray bitmap node, load this leaf texture, and change its RGB color space to sRGB. Connect it to a color correction map and connect the color correction map to the diffuse input. Now select the color correction and slightly increase the gamma to 1.2. Now select the V-Ray material itself, change its mode to roughness and set its reflection color to white. For the reflection roughness map, we need a black and white version of our leaf texture, so connect the original leaf texture to another color correction node. And zero out the saturation. As I'll be using this map later on for the bump mapping as well, I don't want to adjust it here any further. So let's connect it to an output node. And connect that output node to the reflection roughness. The surface is very shiny, which is not what we want, and as we are dealing with roughness, we need to make the incoming map lighter to get a rougher surface. So select the first point and increase its value to around 0.35. And finally, for the bump map, let's connect the color correction that made our leaf texture into a black and white map to the bump map input of a V-Ray normal map node. And connect that node to the bump map input of our material. Now the soil texture is pretty simple as it's a very small element in the composition. We don't need to spend too much time on it. So add a new V-Ray material and assign it to the soil geometry. Change its reflection mode to roughness. Add a new V-Ray bitmap node and load this ground texture. As always, because this is a color input and we are in ACES, change its RGB color space to sRGB and connect it to the diffuse input of the material. And in the material, we can change the reflection color to white and roughness to 0.75. And finally, for the bump map, let's connect the ground texture to a color correction node and change it to a black and white texture by setting the saturation to 0. Now connect the color correction node to the bump map input of the material and maybe increase the bump amount in the material to 60. Now let's create a material for the plant stem. So I'm going to add a new V-Ray material and assign it. For the diffuse color, I will use a mix node to mix between a texture and a color. So add a mix node and connect it to the diffuse color. For color 1, add a new V-Ray bitmap node and load this Bark02 JPEG. And connect it to the first color of the mix node. For the second color, let's add a V-Ray color map and change the color to this green with RGB values of 28, 60, and 0, and connect it to the second color. For the mix amount, let's add a gradients map and connect it to the mix amount input. I just want to make the lower parts of the stem get the texture, and as it gets closer to the leaves, it becomes greener. So I'm gonna change the first color of the gradient to a light gray with the RGB values of 170, the second color to a dark gray with the RGB values of 23, and the third color to black. For the bump map, connect the original texture to a color correction node. And turn it to a black and white map. And connect that color correction map to the bump input of a V-Ray normal map. Increase the normal map amount to 3 and now connect the V-Ray normal map to the bump input of the material. And make sure the material itself is in the roughness mode and increase the roughness to 0.65. And finally, we have this picture frame to take care of with a few simple materials. So let's open up the frame group. For the glass, I can create a simple V-Ray material and use the glass preset and assign it. For the frame itself, we will use a simple white material. So I'm going to create a new material and assign it. Change the diffuse color to a white color with the RGB values of around 210. Reflection color to white and set glossiness to around 0.9. And for the picture, add a new Vase material and assign it. Add a Vase bitmap node and load this poster. Change its color space to sRGB and connect it to the diffuse map. I know, the most boring poster of all time, but that's what we have here. I'm going to change the reflection color to white and decrease the glossiness value to around 0.7. And we are done. For the final render, open up the render setup window. Set the noise threshold to 0.005. Now in the global illumination tab, I'm using brute force as my primary and secondary GI engines. Obviously, you can get a faster render by using light cache, but I'll stick with brute force here to get a bulletproof render, be it longer. Finally, in the render elements tab, add a Vase denoiser. Now let's start our final render, which I've already done that. And here is our final render in the frame buffer. Hopefully you learned something. Sorry I had to make the video as short and concise as possible, but hopefully it was useful. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com or our Gumroad page at gumroad.com/mographplus and check out our premium CGI and rendering courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Maya, Arnold, Corona, Vase, Redshift, Octane, and so on. See you in the next video.